The hand belongs to a man who has worked his entire life. It's marked by old scars, calluses that never softened despite the passing decades, and fingernails that never got fully clean, not even on a Sunday morning. Old man Jerry's hand rises with surgical precision, gripping a forging hammer that weighs nearly 5 pounds. The steel is heavy and weathered, much like its owner. 78 years old, and the strength is still there, coiled in muscles that simply refuse to quit. The hammer drops. The sound is exact, surgical, not the random thud of someone swinging blindly. It's the sound of a man who knows exactly where he wants to land. The impact echoes against the side of the tractor's engine block. It's a 1950s Fordson, a vintage model that Richard had inherited when his grandfather passed away. For the last 5 years, it had been nothing but a rusting heap in the back of the shop, taking up space, a dead presence that no one bothered to look at. Richard stands a few paces away, flanked by 2 hired hands. Both are wearing brand new t-shirts with the farm's official crest, part of that modern corporate image Richard tries to force into every corner of the estate. Richard is 45, wearing a linen suit despite the humid country heat, brand new boots that still mirror the light, and a smile that feels more like a threat than a greeting. He chuckles when he sees Jerry lifting the hammer again. "Hammering junk just makes noise, old man," Richard shouts, his voice dripping with the unearned confidence of someone who's never been told no because he's always had the checkbook to back it up. "Haul that scrap to the junkyard. You're wasting my time with museum pieces." The hired hands laugh along. It's the rehearsed laughter of men who follow the boss, not because they get the joke, but because it's part of the daily ritual. It's part of the hierarchy Richard carefully built to make himself feel important. Jerry doesn't answer. He ignores Richard's voice as easily as he ignores the wind blowing through the property's dirt roads. He's known Richard since he was a toddler running through the fields, chasing chickens and begging his grandfather for a seat on the tractor. He knew Richard's father, too. He remembers what this place was like when it wasn't just a business, but a life. He strikes again, precise. The hammer hits a specific point on the side of the engine block. To someone who doesn't understand machines, it would look like a random blow against rust. But Jerry isn't someone who doesn't understand. Jerry spent 43 years listening to engines, learning every hum, every rattle, every vibration that signaled something was wrong. He sets the hammer on the concrete floor next to the tractor. He walks to the front of the machine and places his hands on the old iron crank handle. It's the kind of manual start that vanished decades ago. The kind that requires raw strength and perfect timing, or you'll break your wrist trying to kick it over. Richard keeps talking. He's lecturing his crew about the new fleet he just bought. High-tech machines, computerized rigs that do everything automatically. Machines that, according to Richard, are the future. Machines that don't blink and don't complain and don't get old because, well, you just throw them away and lease a new one when they fail. Jerry gives the crank one hard turn. Nothing. Richard laughs louder now. "See, trash, it won't even kick. I thought you were supposed to be the specialist. Just so you know, the real equipment arrives tomorrow. None of this ancient garbage that..." Jerry cranks it again. The engine coughs. Twice. Richard goes quiet for a split second, because the sound of that engine coughing is the sound of something that shouldn't be doing anything at all. The third turn. The engine groans. And then, with a roar that echoes across the entire property, the Fordson wakes up. White smoke billows from the exhaust stack. The chassis shakes a bit like a giant shaking off a long slumber. But it's awake. It's alive. It's running. The laugh freezes on Richard's face. His mouth stays open, but no sound comes out. The hired hands trade confused looks as if they can't process what their eyes are seeing. Jerry lets the engine idle. He listens to the rhythm. He diagnoses the noise with ears that, despite being 78 years old, can still identify the heartbeat of a healthy motor. He nods to himself, satisfied, and shuts the machine down. Silence returns. Jerry turns to Richard. He isn't angry. He isn't triumphant. He is simply calm, like someone who knew exactly how this would end and therefore wasn't worried about the process. He picks up the hammer. Not in a threatening way. He just holds it naturally, the way a mechanic does when the job is done. It's a tool returning to its place of rest. "Done," Jerry says, his voice low and devoid of boastfulness. "Just a fact. Now, that'll be $10,000 for the wisdom." Richard opens his mouth, closes it, opens it again. That's insane," he stammers. But what could he say? The machine was running, everyone saw it. You can't argue with physical reality when it's staring you in the face. 10,000, Jerry repeats, setting the hammer aside. For the knowledge you don't have and that you're going to need. Because this machine will last another 10 years if you treat it right. 10 years of work on your land. 10 years that a new machine would cost you 300,000 or 400,000 to cover. If you think about it, I'm giving you a discount. Richard turned his back and walked away toward the main house, his shadows following a few steps behind. Jerry stayed there, looking at the resurrected tractor. The Fordson was silent now, but heat was still radiating from the metal, like an animal that had just woken up and was starting to move again. Jerry placed his hand on the hood. He felt the warm steel under his scarred palms. This tractor had belonged to Richard's grandfather, a man who was nothing like his grandson, a man who understood that machines weren't just investments. They were partners. They were extensions of yourself in the dirt. This tractor had cleared the first paths on this property. It had plowed the first fields. It had hauled the harvest that made this family wealthy. And now Richard wanted to scrap it like it was junk. Jerry lives in a small cottage on the edge of the property. A small white house with a roof he fixes himself every time a storm rolls through, because Richard never offers the materials for repairs. The place has 2 bedrooms, a kitchen that shares space with the living room, and a bathroom that only works when the water pressure is just right, which isn't often. Jerry has been a widower for 14 years. His daughter lives in Chicago, works at a bank, and has a life that is everything he never was. She visits twice a year, looks embarrassed by her father's house, and offers him money that Jerry refuses, because money from a daughter feels like charity. She wants him to move to the city. He refuses because the city is a place to live, not a place to be. Jerry spent 43 years working for Richard's father, and for Richard's grandfather before that. Jerry learned to fix machines by watching older men who are long dead now, men who passed down their trade the same way he would pass it to anyone willing to learn. But nobody wants to learn anymore. Everyone wants the new machines that come with a manual. Everyone wants to push a button and let the machine do the work. Nobody wants to understand why the machine does the work. Richard wants to throw the Fordson away because the Fordson is a machine that demands understanding. It demands you know how to listen to it. It demands you know its habits. It demands you be more than just an operator. It demands you be a partner. 3 days later, Richard shows up at the shop where Jerry is organizing vintage tools. "What do you charge to fix a real machine?" Richard asks. No preamble. "That new one I bought, the engine is making a weird sound. The dealer techs want $1,500 just for a service call. I figured you might handle it for less." Jerry continues organizing his tools. He puts a crescent wrench in its place, then a pair of pliers, then a smaller ball-peen hammer. "I don't fix new machines," he says without turning around. "Why not?" Richard asks. "Because new machines can't be fixed," Jerry replies, turning around. "New machines have to be replaced. You don't fix a machine that's run by a chip and a computer that locks you out. You take it to a technician. The technician sends it to the factory. The factory charges you a fortune because they know you don't have a choice." Richard's face flushes. "Then what's the point of having you here?" he snaps. "Why do I keep you on the payroll?" "For nothing, apparently," Jerry replies. "You want my advice? Sell the new rigs, use the Fordson, learn how to work with it. It'll cost you less in a year than that new machine will cost you in a month." Richard leaves the shop redder than when he walked in. But a week later, when the new tractor breaks down again and the dealership quotes him another astronomical figure, Richard appears in the doorway once more. "Will you fix it?" he asks, his voice different now. Less arrogance, more doubt. Jerry looks at the Fordson parked outside the shop, still idling perfectly. "I'll try," he says. "But it's gonna cost you." "How much?" Richard asks. "We're gonna have to talk about that," Jerry responds. And just like that, without Jerry fully realizing it, he stopped being the invisible old man scraping rust off engines and became the man Richard seeks out when things go wrong. The man whose knowledge is suddenly worth money. The man whose wisdom, ignored for so long, became valuable in an instant. But there's something Richard doesn't get. He doesn't understand that Jerry isn't selling knowledge. He's selling a way of being in the world, a way of seeing machines not as disposable objects, but as companions, a way of working not to stack cash, but to do things right. And that way of being, that philosophy hidden in every precise hammer strike, in every careful listen to an engine's hum, in every adjustment that isn't necessary now but will be in 6 months, That is the wisdom Richard is trying to buy. But you can't buy wisdom. You earn it by living. And Jerry has spent a lifetime living in a way Richard could never grasp. Because Richard was born into a world where money was enough to buy everything. Until now. Now, there was something money alone couldn't grab. Now there was the knowledge of a man who had learned that there is no such thing as junk. Only things that people aren't willing to understand. Jerry started the work early Monday morning. Richard had the new tractor, the one making all the noise, towed to the shop. The man who dropped it off was one of the hands. He didn't say a word, just pointed to where it should go. Jerry nodded and began his inspection. He doesn't use a diagnostic computer like the guys at the big dealerships. He uses the senses 78 years of life gave him. He pops the hood. He places his hand on different parts of the motor. He listens. He touches. He feels the vibration. He presses his ear against the metal block and listens to the stories the engine has to tell. It took Jerry 3 hours to find the problem. It was a simple O-ring that had degraded. A cheap part. A simple part. A part that any parts store should have on the shelf for $5. He scribbled the part number on an old scrap of paper and went to find Richard. He found him on the porch of the big house drinking a beer, looking over the fields like he was surveying his kingdom. Which technically he was. "I need a part," Jerry said, holding out the paper. "Ceiling ring. Specific model. It's cheap. You want to order it, or should I scavenge one from an old tractor and adapt it?" Richard took a sip of his beer. He looked at the paper. His face shifted into that expression of someone who just realized they had an opportunity to be condescending. "An O-ring?" he asked. "That's an old part number. That's probably been discontinued for 20 years. Nobody makes that anymore." "They do," Jerry replied calmly. "The supply shop in the city has them. I checked." "You checked?" Richard drank more beer. "Look, Jerry, you're costing me money every day you're sitting there messing with that scrap metal. If this part existed, you would have fixed it already. Since you haven't, that tells me it doesn't exist, or that you're just too old to handle modern equipment." Richard leaned back in his wicker chair. "Forget the part. Fix it with whatever you've got in there. I want that machine running by tomorrow evening, or I'm having it hauled off." Jerry opened his mouth to argue, but he realized that arguing with Richard was like trying to explain colors to a blind man. Richard had decided Jerry was too old, that the machine was impossible, and that the whole thing was a sham. No words would change that. He turned his back. "Better get moving," Richard yelled after him. "The junk collector who thinks he's an engineer." The hired hand standing by the porch laughed. The same laughter. Jerry didn't run. Jerry never runs. He walked back to his shop with the steady gait of a man who knows exactly what needs to be done. If the O-ring wasn't coming from the outside, he'd have to improvise. Jerry had been doing that for decades. He'd seen his mentor, his first master, improvise parts during the shortages of the old days. He'd seen Richard's own grandfather build entire machines out of scrap when there was no money for new ones. He searched through his stash of old parts. Everything was there. Things others had tossed. Things Richard had left in the shop when he took over, thinking it was just hoarding junk. He found a ceiling ring from an even older Fordson. It wasn't an exact match, but it was close. Very close. He spent the rest of the day adapting the part, using his old tools. Using a manual lathe he powered with his own strength, shaving the metal with precision, testing the fit, shaving again, testing again. While he worked, he didn't realize he had an audience. Peter, Richard's grandson, was 12 years old. He was a curious kid in a way his father's generation never was. While Richard grew up in a world where machines were things you bought ready-made, Peter grew up in a world where you pressed a button on a phone and things appeared at your door. But Peter had that rare spark, genuine curiosity about how things worked. He'd seen Jerry going into the shop Monday morning. He'd heard his grandfather yelling that it was a waste of time. And like kids do, he decided he needed to investigate. He showed up at the shop Tuesday morning. "Hey," Peter said, leaning against the doorframe, watching Jerry work. Jerry looked up. He recognized the boy, Richard's son, or something like that. These big estate families always had a confusing tree. "Hey, kid," Jerry replied. "Stay back, lot of sharp edges in here." But Peter didn't leave, he just stepped back an inch, staying close enough to see. "What are you making?" the boy asked. "Fixing a part," Jerry said, returning to his task. "Why? Can't you just buy a new one?" Jerry smiled. There was something about that question that was so honest about the world Peter lived in that it was almost touching. Because sometimes old things already have a story. Jerry said, holding up the piece to show him. "This part right here? It's from a 1947 tractor. It worked for your great-great-grandfather. Now it's gonna work again. It's about reusing knowledge, kid. It's about not wasting what's already been learned." Peter stepped closer. He looked at the old part Jerry was modifying. "Seems dangerous," the boy said. "Messing with old stuff." "Everything important has a little danger in it," Jerry replied. "An engine that catches fire is dangerous because it's actually working. An engine that does nothing is safe, but it's also dead." Peter sat on a stool near the workbench, and for the first time in his life, he started learning how things functioned. Not through a YouTube video, not through an English manual, but through a man who had spent a lifetime listening to machines. Jerry wasn't trying to teach. He was just talking while he worked, explaining why he shaved the metal at that specific angle, why the fit had to be exact, why Richard's urgency was self-defeating, because old machines teach you patience. "You know," Jerry said as he worked, "a new machine gives you an answer fast. It breaks, you call the tech tells you what's wrong, you pay, and you're done. An old machine is different. An old machine talks to you. It tells you what's wrong through sounds, through smells, through vibrations. You have to learn how to listen." "I never thought about it like that," Peter said. "Most people don't," Jerry replied. "You all grow up thinking that understanding things is a specialist's job, that you can't do it, that it's too hard. That's a lie. It's just that nobody teaches you anymore. My mentor, he learned from his father, who learned from his. It was passed down. Now everyone just wants to outsource." Peter stayed there all afternoon, until his father showed up and took him away, saying he was disturbing the work. But Jerry had planted a seed in that boy, a seed of curiosity that might one day grow. When Peter left, Jerry kept working. He spent all night finishing the part, testing the fit hundreds of times until it was perfect. Not just functional. Perfect. Wednesday morning, he was done. Jerry put the adapted part in place. He sealed the engine. He made every connection that needed to be made. He tested every line. Nothing was left to chance. Then he walked to the Fordson that had been waiting for days, the engine that needed life. He put his hands on the crank. He turned it once. Nothing. Jerry took a breath. He turned it again. The engine coughed. Once. Twice. Almost. But not quite. In that instant, Richard appeared, as if he'd been waiting for it, as if he'd timed exactly when Jerry would try to start it, because he knew he would fail. "See?" Richard said, his voice heavy with the satisfaction of someone who'd been right all along. "It's junk. You were right, old-timer. Tomorrow this machine is gone. What's it weigh, 10,000 pounds of iron? I'll sell it for scrap. At least that'll cover your labor." Richard walked away. His hired hands followed. Jerry stayed silent. He looked at the engine. He looked at the hands that had worked without rest to adapt the part. He looked at everything he had done and realized it wasn't a failure of execution. The timing was off. The alignment had shifted slightly while he was adapting the part. It was a problem he would have caught instantly if he'd had the right part. It would have taken 5 minutes. But because he had to improvise, he'd spent 2 full days, and in the end, the alignment was off by just a hair. 5 degrees. Maybe less. Just enough for the engine to try to catch and then give up, as if it were unsure. It's frustrating to see someone sabotaged like that, isn't it? To see a man who worked with dedication for 43 years be stopped from doing what he does best, simply because of the contempt and arrogance of someone younger with a big bank account. If you also believe that injustice should be called out, hit that like button now to support Jerry. Jerry sat on the shop floor. For the first time in many years, he felt truly tired. Not the tiredness of the body, the tiredness of the soul. The exhaustion of someone who had done what they could with what they had, and had still been declared a failure. He had lost. Round 1 had ended in defeat. But as Jerry sat there, thinking about everything he had left unfinished, he heard a small voice. "Jerry," Peter called, approaching through the back door of the shop, the place where he'd likely snuck in to avoid his father. Jerry looked at the boy. "Hey, Peter," he said, his voice weary. "I saw you trying to start it," Peter said. "I heard it. The engine almost caught. Almost is different from not at all, right?" Jerry didn't answer. He just nodded. "If you want," Peter continued, "I can help you tomorrow. I don't have school. My dad wants me to go to the city this weekend, but I'm free tomorrow." Jerry looked at the boy, and for the first time since Richard said the machine was leaving, A tiny flicker of something appeared in his eyes. It wasn't hope. Not yet. It was just the realization that there was a very small chance things could be different. "You know," Jerry told the boy, "that your dad is going to be furious if he finds out you're here?" "Yeah," Peter replied. "But I figured you could use a hand." Jerry smiled. For the first time in 2 days, he smiled genuinely. "Come on over here then," he said to the boy. "Let me show you a problem your dad can't see because he's too busy looking at what he wants to see." The night was long. Jerry and Peter worked until 11, when the boy had to sneak back home. They had identified the alignment issue. Peter had held the flashlight while Jerry explained every necessary adjustment. The boy had asked questions that showed he was understanding, not just watching. "Are we fixing it tomorrow?" Peter asked as he left. "If we have time, yeah," Jerry replied, knowing it was a gentle lie. That night, Richard sent a message through a hand who appeared at the shop. A verbal message. Short, direct, no room for interpretation. "The truck arrives tomorrow afternoon. The scrapyard picks up the tractor at 3, no matter what." Jerry received the message lying in his bed, in the darkness of his cottage. He understood it completely. There was no negotiation. There was no mercy. There was only a deadline, and he had failed to meet it. He didn't sleep. He spent the whole night thinking, remembering every failure he'd had throughout his life. Not many, because he'd been careful most of the time. But there were some. Engines he couldn't save. Jobs he'd left unfinished. People who had doubted him. But none of them had felt as final as this. None of them had meant that everything he'd worked for was being discarded as trash. In the morning, he got up before dawn. He walked to the shop. The tractor was there, waiting. The part still wasn't aligned correctly. The job was half done. Jerry sat on a stool and put his head in his hands. He could try to fix it now. He could work all morning and maybe, just maybe, get the engine to catch in time. But it was 5 in the morning. The truck was coming at 3. That was 10 hours. And he needed to not just make the engine run. He needed to do it in a way that Richard couldn't deny. But Richard was creative with his denials. There were ways to deny that didn't involve saying no. It involved saying but. But it's just luck. But it needs more tests. But I don't know if it'll last. Jerry needed something that left no room for but. He thought about reaching out to others. There were old employees of the estate, men who had worked with his father, men who knew the Fordson, who had seen it work when it was new. He walked across the property that morning, visiting them one by one. The first was old Joe, who lived in a small house near the creek. Joe was a bit younger than Jerry, maybe 65. He'd worked the farm for 40 years before Richard fired him to hire automated crews. "Joe," Jerry said, "you saw the Fordson working when it was new, right?" "Sure did," Joe replied. But there was something in his eyes that was already an excuse. "Come with me. Come talk to Richard. Tell him that tractor is a healthy machine, that it's worth saving." Joe looked at Jerry with pity. "Pity is the worst look a man can get." "Jerry," he said slowly, "Richard kicked me out 5 years ago. You think he's gonna listen to a word I say? He'll kick me out of this house if I show up in front of him asking for a favor." Jerry knew it was true. He turned and left. He visited 3 more. They all had the same answer. Some were gentler, some were more direct, but the result was the same. Fear. Richard had built a system where people learned that confronting him was more expensive than accepting his decisions. Jerry went back to the shop alone. There was one way, though. There was Peter. Peter had understood. Peter had seen. Peter was Richard's son, and maybe, just maybe, the voice of a child could reach ears that had closed to the voices of men. Jerry organized his things. He opened his old tool chest. He looked for the vintage photographs. He didn't have many, but he had a few. One showed Richard's grandfather at the wheel of the Fordson in 1952, a wide grin on his face, the machine gleaming like it was brand new. He took the photo from the chest, put it in his pocket. He walked to the main house. He didn't go through the front door. He went through the kitchen where the staff knew him and didn't stop him. He looked for Peter in the bedrooms. He found him playing video games in his room. "Peter," Jerry called, "come here. I need to show you something." Peter turned off the game immediately. That hunger to learn was still in his eyes. Jerry showed him the photo. "See?" he said, pointing to Peter's great-grandfather's face. "That's your kin. This tractor here, this tractor your dad wants to throw away, is the machine that built this place. Your family is rich because this tractor worked, because a man kept it running. And now your dad wants to destroy it like it's nothing. Peter looked at the photo with that look a child gets when they start to realize the world is more complicated than it seemed. Why are you showing me this? Peter asked. Because I need you to do something, Jerry replied. I need you to talk to your dad. I need you to tell him that tractor deserves a chance. I need you to convince him. Peter looked at the photo, then at Jerry. My dad doesn't like it when I question him, Peter said, with the wisdom kids develop living with adults who don't listen. I know, Jerry replied, but try anyway, please. That afternoon, Peter walked into the office where Richard was working on farm documents. Dad? The boy called. Richard looked up from his papers. Yeah? Why do you want to throw away Jerry's tractor? Richard set his pen down. His face shifted into forced patience, the kind adults use for questions they think are naive. Peter, Jerry is an old man who doesn't understand the world has changed. That tractor is scrap. New machines work better. But, Peter started, he's almost got it fixed. It just needs... No, Richard cut in, his voice losing the patience. I don't want to hear another word about that tractor. And I don't want you hanging around Jerry, you hear me? He's filling your head with outdated nonsense. You need to learn about modern tech, not Grandpa's tools. But, I said no, Richard yelled, his voice echoing. I'm not debating this with a kid, that's enough. Peter left the room, his eyes watering. He didn't go tell Jerry he'd failed. He knew Jerry would understand just by his absence, by the fact that he didn't show up at the shop that afternoon. Jerry understood. He was sitting in the shop when Peter should have arrived. The boy didn't come. Jerry waited an hour. 2. He realized Richard had forbidden it. The loneliness of that moment was absolute. Jerry had tried everything. He'd tried his expertise. He'd tried persuasion. He'd tried appealing to the heart of a boy. And it had all failed. There was only one thing left. He looked at the tractor. He looked at the part he'd adapted. He looked at everything he'd done. And he realized there was only one act he could do now that was truly definitive. There was only one way to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the machine could work. There was only one way to make Richard stop. Jerry picked up his hammer, the same one he'd used so many times, the same one that had brought the Fordson to life weeks ago. He walked to the tractor. He ran his hand over the metal, felt the cold of the machine, thought about everything it meant, thought about Richard's grandfather, thought about Peter, thought about himself, and then he moved, not to destroy, to correct. It's heartbreaking to see a man who did everything right be stopped from finishing his work because of someone else's fear and arrogance, isn't it? To see a child forbidden from learning from someone who has so much to teach. If you also believe that integrity should be recognized, hit that like button to support Jerry. Jerry worked all night. He worked with an urgency he hadn't felt in years. He worked knowing there was only one window, a gap between 3 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon. He adjusted the alignment of the ceiling ring, not with the precision of a careful craftsman, with the precision of a desperate man who knows exactly where to strike. He tested it, missed by a few millimeters, adjusted again, tested again, better, but not perfect. Nothing is perfect when you're racing the clock, but perfect wasn't the goal anymore. Alive was the goal. When the sun began to rise, Jerry was finished. He put his hands on the crank. He breathed, and he turned. The engine coughed once, twice, and then it roared. A full, healthy roar, the sound of a machine waking after years of sleep, refusing to stay dead, insisting on living. Jerry let the engine run, then he shut it down. He sat on the shop floor, and he waited for Richard to come with the scrap truck, because now, when Richard arrived, Jerry had something that wasn't an argument. It was evidence. It was physical truth that was impossible to deny. The tractor worked, and in a few hours Richard would have to make a choice. Admit he was wrong, or be seen as a man who destroyed a perfectly functioning machine just because he was told he should. Richard arrived at 2:30. The scrap truck was already parked on the property. 2 men in oil-stained t-shirts were smoking near the rig, waiting to load the junk Richard had decided to toss. Richard stepped out of his SUV, surrounded by his guys. His face had the expression of someone coming to handle a minor chore. To Richard, Jerry and the tractor were administrative debris that needed clearing. He walked to the shop. "Time to haul it out," he said to the scrap men. Jerry was standing by the tractor. He was holding his hammer, the same hammer, as if he'd been waiting for this exact moment. "Wait," Jerry said. Richard paused. He looked at the old man, his face already showing he was annoyed by any delay. "One last thing," Jerry continued. "You want to see the tractor run, or you want it out of here without knowing?" Richard took a deep breath. There was something in his eyes that was almost pity. Pity for someone who still thought a demonstration would change anything. "Fine," he said, just to get it over with. "Show me." Jerry walked to the engine. He put his hand on the metal block. And then, with precision that came from a lifetime of knowledge, he started to tap. It wasn't the wild swinging of someone hitting scrap. It was a series of specific hammer strikes, applied to specific points on the engine's flywheel. Small corrections. Adjustments that no modern tool could make because no modern tool understood that the flywheel had warped by a hair, that the compression had shifted, that the axle had moved with time and rust. Every strike had a reason. Every blow was an adjustment. Every sound was data to the man who knew how to listen. Richard watched, the hands watched, the scrap men watched. When Jerry finished, he set the hammer aside. He walked to the crank handle. He turned it once. The engine coughed. He turned it again. The engine roared. It roared with all its might, with all its health. The clear voice of a machine that refused to be dead. Jerry let the engine run for a minute. He let everyone hear that sound Richard had called impossible. He let no one be able to deny what they were seeing and hearing. Then he shut it off. The silence that followed was absolute. Richard opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "How did you—" He started but didn't finish. Jerry walked to the fuel tank of the tractor. "Come here," he called. Richard approached, his hired hand staying a few steps back. Jerry opened the tank. "Smell it," he said. Richard leaned in. He sniffed. His face changed. "That's not diesel," he whispered. "No," Jerry replied. "It's biofuel made from crop waste, soy, corn, even used oil dregs. You think that tractor over there," he pointed to one of Richard's new ones, "can run on that? It'd corrode the electronics, wreck the injection, and cause chaos in the computer sensors." Richard looked at the tank like he was seeing a ghost. "How long have you been doing this?" he asked. 23 years, Jerry replied. "Ever since I started thinking it didn't make sense to pay to bring fuel in when the farm produces what it needs. I started with notes, then tests, then results. It took time, but now it's a science. And this tractor, the one you wanted to throw away, is the perfect machine to run on it because it's simple, it's robust. It doesn't have a computer trying to control everything. It just works." Richard walked around the tractor as if he were seeing it for the first time. "What's the horsepower?" he asked. 30, Jerry replied. "It was never a powerhouse, but it's consistent. It works all day without failing. And here's the important part. The operating cost is 1/10 of your new tractor, because the fuel is made here, because the parts are easy to find or adapt, because it doesn't need to go to a pricey dealership every time something blinks." Richard stopped in front of Jerry. His eyes had changed. There was no more contempt. There was calculation. "You developed this alone?" Richard asked. "Yes," Jerry replied. "How long did it take?" "Over 2 decades, Jerry answered. "Sleepless nights, failed tests, broken engines, formulas that had to be rewritten." Richard stepped closer. His tone had shifted completely. Now it was the tone of a businessman who had spotted an opportunity. "What do you want for the rights?" Richard asked. "For the formula, the methodology, everything. I can scale this. I can sell it to other estates. This is worth millions." Jerry didn't answer immediately. "Do you understand what I'm saying?" Richard continued. "I'm offering you a fortune. You pass the formula to me, and you never have to work again. Your family, everything is settled." "I don't have family," Jerry replied. "I have a daughter in Chicago who wants nothing to do with this. I have a small house. I have my work." "Exactly," Richard said, seeing it as simplicity he could exploit. "You work because you have to. Work for me. Develop more. Create new formulas. I'll pay you incredibly well. You get rich. Everyone wins." Jerry looked at Richard, and for the first time he understood exactly who Richard was. He wasn't necessarily an evil man. He was a man who saw everything in terms of profit, who saw creativity as a commodity to be bought, who saw knowledge as something to be owned by whoever paid the most. "No," Jerry said. Richard blinked. "Excuse me?" "I said no," Jerry repeated. "I'm not selling the formula. I'm not working for you to develop more. I'm not turning 23 years of research into a product you sell to corporations that will patent it and overcharge poor farmers just like you're doing now. Richard stepped back as if he'd been slapped. You're losing out on millions, he said, his voice sharpening. I am, Jerry agreed. But I'm not selling my knowledge. I'm keeping it alive. And now I'm going to do something different. Jerry walked into his shop. He looked for an old, worn-out notebook filled with over 2 decades of scribbles. He came back and handed it to Richard. This? Richard asked, confused. Everything you need to know, Jerry replied. Every formula, every ratio, every test I did, every mistake I made. It's all in there. Richard opened the notebook, flipped through it. Why? He asked. If you won't sell, why are you giving it to me? Because you have resources I don't, Jerry replied. You can get this research to small farmers. You can create a process that isn't patented, that's open source, that's public property. You can turn this into a tool for independence instead of a tool for profit. That's insane, Richard said. I'd invest resources to develop this and then gain nothing. You'd gain plenty, Jerry replied. You'd gain a tractor that runs for pennies. You'd gain an estate that doesn't depend on expensive fuel from a multinational corporation. You'd gain true food security because when prices spike out there and here, things keep moving exactly the same. Richard flipped through the notebook, processing everything that had happened. You're crazy, old man, he said finally. I'm smart, Jerry replied, because I realize something you're still learning. True wealth isn't money. It's autonomy. It's knowing how to do things that nobody else knows. It's being able to stand on your own without depending on anyone. Richard looked at the tractor, then at the notebook in his hands, then at Jerry. And my bill? He asked. The $10,000 you quoted? You want to pay it? Jerry replied. Fine. You want to give the notebook to some tech and try to replicate the research? Also fine. But that'll take years. Or you can realize that what you're holding is more valuable than money because it's knowledge. And knowledge is the only currency that doesn't devalue over time. Richard looked through the notebook. If I do this, he said slowly, if I really put this out there, open the research, will you work with me? Not to make money, but to help make it work, Jerry breathed. Maybe, he replied, but as a consultant, not an employee, I keep my independence. Deal, Richard agreed. He was still in shock, but there was something in his eyes that looked like recognition. Deal. We have an agreement. Jerry held out his hand. Richard shook it. And in that handshake, the meaning of the story changed completely. It was no longer about an old man fixing an old machine. It was about the transmission of knowledge that transcended power, money, and ego. The scrap men were still there, waiting to load the tractor. You guys can go, Richard said. The tractor stays. The men traded confused looks and drove off. It's incredible to see a man work 23 years on research, develop a genuine solution for his community's problems, and be willing to share it all without making a dime, while watching others get rich on stolen ideas, isn't it? If you also believe that integrity and true knowledge deserve to be honored, hit that like button to support Jerry. Jerry walked out of the shop. The tractor was there, idling smoothly, its engine working perfectly. He put his hand on the warm metal. And he smiled. It wasn't a smile of victory. It was the smile of someone who had finally realized that the true value of a life of work wasn't how much you owned at the end, but how many people you managed to leave wiser than when you started. Richard walked into the shop with his checkbook. It wasn't the attitude of a defeated man. It was the attitude of someone who realized he'd lost a specific battle, but still believed he could win the war with cash. Richard had spent 45 years learning that money solved everything. There was no reason to think it would be different now. He wrote a check, $50,000. This is for a year of consulting, Richard said, holding it out. You work for me, you develop more, you help me scale the operation. Jerry looked at the check. He glanced at the paper. The amount was truly substantial. More money than he'd seen in his entire life combined. He handed the check back to Richard. $10,000 for the fix today, Jerry said. For the wisdom of knowing where to hit it. For the 23 years of research it took to get that knowledge. $10,000 is a fair price for that. Richard took the check back. His face was pure confusion. You don't want the rest? He asked. No, Jerry replied, because the rest would be for me to work for you. and I've spent my whole life working for people. Now, I don't want to work for anyone. I want to work for myself." "Then why accept the 10,000? Richard asked, genuinely curious now. "Because you have an obligation to recognize the work," Jerry replied. "Because nobody else does. Because a man who worked 43 years deserves to have today's work paid for. It doesn't have to be a fortune, but it has to be recognized." Richard tore up the check and wrote a new one, $12,000 this time. $2,000 extra for having patience with me," he said, handing over the paper. Jerry set the check on the workbench. "There's one more thing," he said. "What?" Richard asked. "The Fordson stays here. It doesn't leave the property. It stays as a backup machine. And more importantly, it stays so Peter can learn." Richard started to protest. His son, who had inherited the property and the father's arrogance, had forbidden any contact between Peter and Jerry. He'd said it was a waste of time, just an old man's hobby. But Richard had finally understood something different. "Fine," he said. "Peter learns from you. And the third thing," Jerry continued, "you hire me as a consultant, not for development, for maintenance and efficiency. I look at your new machines, I identify what's wrong. I help prevent breakdowns. You pay a dignified wage. You respect me in front of your crew. You let me work my way." "How much?" Richard asked. $5,000 a month, Jerry replied. "You think it's high, I think it's fair. If you think it's too much, I'll keep living in my cottage and you leave the Fordson alone." Richard took a deep breath. He was being negotiated by a man who just turned down $50,000. Richard was used to negotiating with people who were hungry for cash. This was a different breed of man. "All right," Richard agreed. $5,000 a month. You work with me, the Fordson, and Peter." Jerry nodded. That night, Richard gathered all the property employees and announced publicly that Jerry would be the new maintenance and efficiency consultant, that every new machine arriving would be inspected by him, that any decision on maintenance would pass through his judgment. There were guys there who had laughed at Jerry weeks before. Now they stood in silence, watching the old man be placed above them in the pecking order. Jerry didn't care about the hierarchy. He just wanted respect, and he finally had it. The first months were hard. Richard still tried to push his will. When Jerry said a new machine should be shut down for preventive maintenance, Richard questioned why. When Jerry suggested using biofuel in one of the older rigs for a test, Richard thought it was a waste of time. But slowly the results started to show. Richard's new machines broke down less often. The bills from the dealership techs dropped drastically. Fuel costs plummeted. The old machines, properly maintained, lasted longer than Richard had predicted. 3 months later, Richard asked Jerry to travel with him to a meeting with other estate owners. Jerry explained his techniques. He explained how vintage machines still had value. He explained how preventive maintenance saved more money than buying new machines every year. The owners listened. Some even hired Jerry as a consultant. Richard saw the potential. He tried to set up a consulting firm under Jerry's name, charging for calls to other properties. Jerry refused. "That's yours," he told Richard. "You set up the company, you charge what you want, you keep the profit. I only consult for the small family farms that can't pay. For free. Because those farmers can't afford you, but they need to learn how to keep their machines running without spending everything they earn." Richard looked at Jerry like he was an alien. "You're impossible," Richard said, but his tone was full of admiration. "I'm consistent," Jerry replied. "Consistency looks impossible to someone used to things changing every week." A year later, Richard's estate had transformed. There was a small biofuel production unit built near the shop. Jerry had designed it and overseen the construction. It wasn't an industrial operation. It was simple, efficient, and used what the property already grew. The Fordson tractor was completely restored. Not just functional, beautiful. Jerry had spent months restoring every part, working alongside Peter, who was now 13 and knew more about engines than most certified techs. Jerry didn't live in the cottage anymore. Richard had renovated one of the small houses on the property for him. It was still simple, but the roof didn't leak, the bathroom worked, and the kitchen had hot water. Jerry had teared up when he saw the result. It wasn't luxury. It was dignity. That morning, exactly a year after that first encounter with the hammer, Richard was standing in front of the restored Fordson. Peter was at the wheel. The boy was learning to drive the vintage machine. Richard watched. Jerry stood beside them, giving instructions, his hand resting on the gleaming metal, guarding the knowledge he'd poured into that machine. Richard walked over. "How's she sound?" Richard asked, referring to the motor. "Perfect," Jerry replied. "This tractor will last another 30 years if it's kept this way." Richard looked at Peter. The boy's eyes were locked on the task, focused, understanding what he was doing instead of just pushing buttons. "You know," Richard said, "when you first came in here banging on this thing with your hammer, I thought you were out of your mind." "You thought I was invisible," Jerry corrected. "You thought I was crazy too. But the main thing was, you thought I didn't matter." Richard nodded. "Fair," he agreed. "I'm learning that you do." Jerry didn't answer. He just kept instructing Peter, explaining every detail of the operation, making sure the knowledge was passed down correctly. Richard watched. He had grown up in a world where knowledge was intellectual property, patented, protected, sold. Jerry came from a world where knowledge was sacred, passed from generation to generation, the most valuable thing a man could leave behind. Richard had tried to buy that knowledge. He'd offered a fortune. Jerry had refused. And in that refusal, Richard had finally realized there were things in this world that money couldn't touch. That night, in the renovated house where Jerry now lived, there was a gathering. Richard, his wife, Peter, and some of the long-term employees. Jerry prepared a simple meal with his own ingredients. As they ate, Richard stood up. "I want to apologize," he said, looking at Jerry, "for how I treated you, for how I dismissed what you know, for the time I wasted thinking new was better than wise." Jerry ate calmly. "Apology accepted," he said. "Now you know better. You teach your son teaches his. That's the only repayment that counts." Richard looked at Peter, who was watching the conversation with that intent look of a child realizing something important is happening. "There's one more thing," Richard said. "I'm setting up a scholarship. It's going to be in your name, for kids from working-class families who want to learn about mechanics, maintenance, the real work Jerry does. I want more people to learn this before it disappears." Jerry set his spoon down. "Now you're thinking right," he said. Justice had come, but not in the way anyone would have guessed. It hadn't come as a punishment for Richard. It had come as an education. Richard had been forced to recognize that his money and power weren't enough to solve everything, that there was value in wisdom earned through work, observation, and patience. And Jerry had his dignity restored, not through a spectacular victory, but through slow, genuine recognition, through the chance to pass on his craft, through the respect he finally received from those who had once looked right through him. To me, it's maddening to see systems where money is valued over wisdom, where the new is picked over the proven, and where those with less knowledge but more power control those who know everything but have nothing, isn't it? If you also believe that integrity, craft, and wisdom deserve to be honored over fortune, hit that like button to support Jerry. A year and a half later, the Fordson tractor had become famous among the local farmers. They came to learn from Jerry, to learn how to keep old machines alive, to learn how to make their own fuel, to learn that knowledge was cheaper than ignorance. Richard, seeing the potential, expanded the program. But he kept Jerry's principles. Nothing patented, nothing sold, open to anyone willing to learn. And slowly, silently, the way people thought about machines, about work, and about value started to shift. Jerry never got rich, but he got respected. And respected, for a man who had spent his life being invisible, was worth more than any fortune. He still swung his hammer. He still put his hands on engines. He still taught anyone who would listen. But now, when he hammered, the sound was different. It was the sound of a man who had finally reclaimed his place. This story taught us that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in shared wisdom, recognized dignity, and knowledge passed through the generations. If you believe that stories like this, of men who refuse to be invisible and refuse to sell their integrity, deserve to be told, subscribe to the channel to join our community. Because these are the stories that remind us there is still respect in this world for those who know how to do things right.